Worst shock ever, my affair screamed his lungs out. My husband put his car on fire. He found out, hey, Reddit using a throwaway account. Because I do not want this associated with my main account, I need advice on how to save my marriage, as I am in a real binder here. My husband set my affair partner's car on fire and then kicked me out of the house, and I genuinely don't know if there's any way to save my marriage. My name is Anna, and I'm a 29-year-old woman. My husband's name is Richard, and he is a 28-year-old man. Richard and I met in college, and we were instantly attracted to each other. We dated passionately until we decided to tie the knot about it a year ago. And for the past year of our marriage, it was pure bliss. Except for one significant fact, I was cheating on him. Richard was always deeply engrossed in his tech career, always tinkering with codes and algorithms, and that left me with plenty of free time at home. He earned more than enough to cover our bills, so my role naturally shifted to managing our household. In the house chores, you see, Richard was always off doing his thing, and I was left at home having to entertain myself, feeling pretty darn lonely. I tried all sorts of stuff to keep busy, like painting, gardening, and experimenting in the kitchen, but none of it really stuck. It was like a cycle. I found something new to do, got excited about it, and then boom, back to feeling empty and craving real connection. I missed having someone to hang out with, chat, and just have a good time. It wasn't that I didn't get why Richard was so busy. I did. But it was tough being on my own for long stretches of time. Loneliness hits hard. You know, I just wanted someone to share life's moments with, laugh together, and feel connected. It was like this constant battle against quiet, empty moments that seemed to drag on forever. So how did I meet my affair partner? Well, you see, back in high school, there was this guy, let's call him Mark. He was the type who could charm anyone, but behind that charm was a mess of drama. Mark and I had a turbulent relationship, like lots of cheating, drugs, and disrespect. It tore me apart, and I knew I had to break free from that toxic cycle. I broke up with him right after we graduated high school. Then I went to college where I met Richard. He was steady, kind, loyal, caring, and respectful. Everything Mark wasn't. We fell in love and got married, leaving the chaos behind. Life with Richard was peaceful until Mark showed up. Out of nowhere, Mark resurfaced like a ghost from my past. He reached out to me and apologized. He said he didn't know I was married, and that despite that, he still wanted to meet up and apologize in person. Despite my hesitation, curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed to meet him for closure meeting. Mark was like opening an old dusty book filled with memories, some sweet, many bitter. We reminisced about our high school days, the drama, the laughter, and the friendships that either faded or evolved. It felt oddly comforting to connect with someone from my past, especially during those moments when Richard was buried deep in work. Loneliness has a way of creeping in even in the happiest of marriages. Richard tried his best to be there for me, but his demanding job often took his time. So when Mark suggested staying in touch, I saw it as a lifeline, a way to fill the gaps. When Richard couldn't, little did I know how dangerous that lifeline would become. As Mark and I got back in touch, we started talking more and more. It became a routine for me to check my phone, constantly waiting for his messages. This new habit didn't go unnoticed by Richard. He asked me why I was always glued to my phone, and I made up a story about getting into context creation, which seemed to satisfy him. The truth was, I was enjoying the attention and conversation with Mark, especially during the times when Richard was busy with work. It felt like a breath of fresh air amidst the boringness of my daily life. The more I chatted with Mark, the more I found myself pulling away from Richard. It wasn't something I planned, it just kind of happened. As our conversations deepened, Mark seemed to get me in ways Richard didn't, or maybe I just never opened up to Richard like I did with Mark. We talked about everything under the sun, creating a bond that felt familiar yet thrillingly new. I knew I was drifting away from my marriage. Mark's understanding and attention filled a void I didn't even realize existed. It wasn't just about the excitement of a secret connection, it was about feeling truly heard and valued, in a way that was different from my relationship with Richard. I confided more in Mark, and I unintentionally distanced myself emotionally from Richard. It was like building a separate world where I could be someone else away from the routines and expectations of marriage. Mark hadn't really changed much since high school. He was still into drugs, and you couldn't always rely on him, but he had this charm that drew you in, made you forget about his flaws. He seemed more grown up now, but you could still see glimpses of his old self back then. I wasn't the most outgoing person. Mark's popularity helped me make friends, but they were more like acquaintances. People liked being around us because of him. After reconnecting with Mark post-marriage, I found solace in our talks. It felt good to have someone to chat with, someone who seemed to get me. I didn't think too much about his faults. I just enjoyed the connection we had. Looking back, I see that I was looking for something outside my marriage, seeking comfort and attention. Mark became an escape from the routine, a way to feel special again. It wasn't about him being better than Richard, it was about feeling understood and valued, even if only for a while. As I hung out more with Mark, our talks weren't just limited to texts or calls. Anymore, we started meeting up in person, hitting up coffee shops, catching a flick, or just WWing around town. It felt good to have someone to share these simple joys with. Mark's outgoing vibe rubbed off on me, and it boosted my confidence and made me more willing to try new things. I found myself stepping out of my comfort zone, exploring new places, and enjoying being with someone who got me. Our chats weren't just about small talk, we talked about movies, books, life experiences, and more. It was very refreshing to have deep conversations and feel mentally stimulated again. It was like unlocking a part of me that had been dormant for a while. These hangouts with Mark brought excitement and freshness into my routine. Something I had been craving. It was easy to get caught up in the fun and forget about the possible consequences. Just relishing in the companionship and shared interests, Mark and I kept up our hangouts, just enjoying each other's company. Despite the warning signs waving like crazy, I was too caught up in the moment to pay much attention. One big flag was that I always ended up footing the bill whenever we went out. Mark had a knack for conveniently forgetting his wallet or coming up with reasons why he couldn't pay. If he did borrow money, it was like throwing it into a black hole. I never saw it again, but hey, I was happy to have someone to hang out with. So I brushed it off. Our hangouts evolved from coffee shops and cinemas to chilling at each other's places. Since Mark still lived with his folks, my place became our go-to spot. He loved hanging out at my place, especially Richard's gaming room. Our house was pretty sweet. We had a pool, a man cave, and a gaming room. Mark adored. He could spend hours in there lost in games and enjoying the setup. We chat, watch movies, and just have a blast together. It was like having a buddy around whenever I needed one. As Mark and I spent more time together, our friendship took on a playful, flirty vibe. We tease each other, exchange witty banter, and throw in some playful compliments here and there. It was all in good fun. At least that's what we said. We promised to never cross any lines or take our banter seriously. I was married and didn't want to cheat on my husband, so at first we never went beyond flirting, but we kept joking around and teasing each other. Other things started to get real. Our banter turned into serious flirting, and it felt like we were back in high school, all giddy and excited. Then one day when Mark was hanging out at my place, things went further than they should have. I had been joking around casually with Mark, and then I sat on his lap as I joke, but then he would let me get up. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were making out and I was kissing him and tugging him to my room after that intense moment with Mark. I was freaked out. It felt good, but I was also terrified I kicked him out and blocked him, fearing my husband might somehow find out guilt. Hit me hard, but a few hours later I caved in and unblocked. Mark, we talked, and it turned out we both wanted more. We decided to keep it quiet, especially since Richard wasn't home much. We could sneak around without anyone knowing. That's where things took a wrong turn with Mark around. I didn't feel alone anymore. It was like he became my go-to instead of Richard. Whenever Richard was out, Mark would come over and we'd act like a couple doing things that should have been reserved for Richard and me. We would have sex. Right in the room that I shared with Richard, we would watch movies, cook together, and just hang out. It felt wrong, and I know it was cruel, but the thrill overshadowed any guilt I had as time went on. I found myself tangled up in this affair with Mark. It was like living a double life, playing the role of a happy wife with Richard, while sneaking around with Mark for excitement and fulfillment. Our meetings and hangouts became even more frequent and daring. And it always happened whenever Richard was out of town or busy. I just couldn't resist the temptation, even though guilt was always lingering in the back of my mind. Emotionally, Mark and I also grew closer. We shared intimate conversations, revealing parts of ourselves that I never shared with Richard. It created this bond that felt real and comforting, and it made me question my feelings and loyalty to my marriage. As more time passed, I started to question my commitment to Richard and the life we had built together. Mark was like my escape from the boringness and loneliness I felt. In my marriage, he made me feel alive and desired in ways I hadn't experienced in a long time. Despite my deepening connection with Mark and the thrill he brought into my life, my love for Richard remained strong. I valued the stability and comfort Richard provided. He was reliable, hardworking, and had a promising future ahead, unlike Mark, whose life seemed way more uncertain and risky. But Mark's charm and ability to manipulate situations often clouded my judgment. He had a way of making things seem acceptable, even when I knew deep down they were wrong. He convinced me that our affair was harmless and was just a temporary escape from the routine of marriage. I desperately wanted to believe him. I needed reassurance that what I was doing wasn't morally wrong, that I wasn't betraying Richard's trust. In the worst way, Mark's persuasive words became a lifeline, and it fed into my doubts and insecurities about my relationship. He assured me that we were too clever for Richard to ever suspect anything, that our affair was discreet and foolproof. He made me believe that Richard wouldn't even consider the possibility of infidelity. I should have seen through Mark's lies and manipulation. It was foolish of me to believe that we could carry on without Richard ever finding out. By the time Richard discovered our affair, Mark and I had been together for months. Mark's assurances had made me have a false sense of security, and that made me lazy and stupid in covering my tracks. Our routine had become so careless. Richard's work trips became opportunities for Mark to spend long periods at our home. Sometimes even staying overnight. I had grown used to Mark's presence to the point where I didn't bother hiding any evidence of our relationship. I let my guard down, thinking that Richard would never suspect a thing on the day Richard was supposed to leave for a 2-day trip. I was excited at the fact that I would spend uninterrupted time with Mark during those 2 days. I played the role of the supportive wife, helping Richard pack his bags, driving him to the airport, and told him goodbye with a smile on my face. Little did I know that this would be the beginning of the end of my deception. I had already informed Mark about Richard's trip before I drove Richard to the airport, so I expected Mark to be on his way home by the time I returned. As predicted, Mark arrived just 30 minutes after I got back. By then, we were so accustomed to our routine that Mark knew his way around our house. Without any hesitation, I had casually mentioned to Mark that Richard would be away for 2 days, so he brought his overnight bag along. We had breakfast together and enjoyed each other's company while watching a movie, and after we finished eating, the mood shifted and we both wanted to have sex. We started making out and then moved to the bedroom. However, we were so busy we didn't even notice when Richard had unexpectedly come back home. He had never left for any trip. It was all a plan to catch me red-handed as we were still busy having sex. The bedroom door burst open, which shocked us both. I screamed in shock and I instinctively tried to cover myself. Surprisingly, Richard remained calm and composed. Mark, realizing the gravity of the situation and that we were busted, hastily gathered his clothes and rushed to leave. Even stumbling in his hurry, Richard made no attempt to stop him. He simply watched as Mark hastily left the house. Meanwhile, I was left feeling utterly ashamed and exposed, and I was still desperately trying to conceal my body and hide from Richard's piercing gaze after Mark bolted out in a frenzy. I heard him scream. It was such a gut-wrenching scream. The kind of scream that came directly from your lungs. I quickly covered up and rushed outside to see what was wrong and maybe deal with the mess. Mark's screams were like a punch in the gut. It was char. It was a total disaster. Mark's car was on fire, flames, dancing smoke billowing, and Mark a total mess of emotions. Mark didn't park directly in our compound, as we didn't want anyone spotting his car in the compound and mentioning it to my husband. So we usually parked not too far from our house. I rushed back to grab our fire extinguisher like my life depended on it, hoping it would be enough to put out the fire. The heat was crazy, and I was sweating so much my sweat even began to mix with panic. As I battled against the flames, we had wanted to call the fire safety department, but ultimately we put out the flames, and there was no need to call them. Mark was crying at this point, which, now that I think about it, is hilarious. He even tried to blame me for the whole ordeal, and I had to remind him that I didn't light the fire. My mind was racing. I was trying to make sense of it all. The truth was staring me in the face. This wasn't some accident. Someone had deliberately set Mark's car on fire, and the timing was just too perfect. Richard's absence during all this was suspicious. He has stayed inside the house and didn't even come out, even when he heard Mark screaming. I knew deep down that Richard had been the one to do it. A car didn't just suddenly engulf itself in flames. Richard must have been the one to set it on fire before coming into the house. Mark cried his heart out, saying his car meant the world to him. He accused Richard of setting it on fire, but had no proof to back it up. I left him to deal with his mess and went back inside, where Richard was calm and collected, cooking in the kitchen. It hit me. Then that Richard had caught me red-handed. Cheating a few minutes ago, I tried crying and pleading, hoping Richard would forgive me, but he was firm. He gave me 10 minutes to pack up and leave or face eviction. I scrambled to gather my things and carry them out to the porch. I cried relentlessly, but Richard remained unmoved, and he literally banged the door on me. Desperate, I tried calling Mark for shelter, but he had already left and abandoned his burnt car. Or maybe B was going to get it towed. He didn't answer my calls. And 30 seconds later, he sent me a text blaming me entirely and cutting ties with me, telling me to never ever send him a message again. I felt utterly lost. I had nowhere to turn. My family was hours away, and I wasn't sure if they'd even take me in. Richard seized the car keys and had denied me from taking any of his cars. With Mark also shutting me out, I reached out to an old friend who reluctantly agreed to let me stay for just a week. I had to grab an Uber to get to my friend's place. Because I had nothing left to add, insult to injury, Mark had emptied our joint account, leaving me broke. And penniless, I messaged him, practically begging him to leave me something, but he refused, claiming it was all his hard-earned money. My friend had to help me pay the Uber. Now I met my friends, feeling like a total wreck. I've been crying non-stop, regretting every choice that led me here. That's why I'm here on Reddit, hoping someone has a clue on how I can fix the colossal mess I've made of my marriage. I know I've made a terrible mistake, and now I facing the consequences of my actions. I'm torn between guilt, regret, and a desperate desire to salvage what's left of my relationship with Richard. I don't want to lose my husband. Any real advice would mean the world to me right now. Thanks for lending an ear update. Hey, Reddit things have been insane since my last post. I've been steering clear of the comments for a bit because they've been brutal. It's been roughly a week since I first shared my story, and the flood of DMs hasn't slowed down the comments range from supportive to downright nasty, with many of you all pointing fingers at me, and I want to set the record straight. I'm not painting my husband as the bad guy. I'm just sharing my side of the story honestly. If he hadn't neglected me, maybe things wouldn't have gone down this path. But dwelling on blame won't fix anything. As for updates, not much has changed. I have to leave my friend's place soon and bounce between couch surfing and shelters. It's not ideal, but I'm trying to make do. My husband mentioned legal papers are on the way, so I'm bracing myself for that too. In the meantime, I'm taking up little gigs to save up enough money. My goal is to have a stable place to go after the divorce. I'm going to go back home to my parents going back home. Even if it's post-divorce would be a relief and would be better than homelessness. Update, hey, Reddit quick update. I've been served with divorce papers. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but deep down I know it's probably for the best. I'll be heading to court soon to finalize everything. I'm ready to sign the papers because let's face it, I messed up big time. On another note, Mark hasn't reached out to me, and honestly, I don't expect him to. I realize now that I was just a temporary distraction for him. Nothing more, it hurts. But I can't blame him for that. I blame myself for letting him back into my life, despite knowing how toxic our history was to keep afloat. I'm still juggling side gigs for some income. It's not much, but it's enough to keep me going. I'll probably share another update after the court proceedings. I don't want to dwell on the legal stuff, and hopefully it'll be swift since I've already agreed to sign the papers update. Hey Reddit, it's been a minute. I took a break from here because the comments were pretty harsh to say the least, but I also received some kind DMs asking about the outcome. So here's the final update. The court proceedings were straightforward. The divorce was finalized without much hassle. Since I had already signed the papers, it's official. We're divorced now. Before we went into the courtroom, I tried to talk to Richard, maybe sway him into thinking I was making a mistake, but he wouldn't even look at me. He expressed his disgust and told me bluntly that he was the one who set the car on fire, and in his eyes it was justified given what I had done. He said I deserved it for being so selfish and ungrateful. It hit me very hard, and I had a moment in the bathroom to let it all out. And by let it all out, I mean I cried a lot in the bathroom. Seeing Richard there made me realize how much I had missed him. But it's too late now, and I have to accept that on the bright side, I managed to save enough money to come back home. My parents agreed to let me stay for a while. Though they weren't happy about it due to what happened, they, along with everyone else, believe I brought this upon myself and that I deserve being divorced, and honestly, it stings that even and my own family won't support me, but I just have to make do since I can't afford to move out now, so I can't argue with them. Job hunting is next on my agenda. Despite the huge gap in my resume, I'm hopeful I'll find something that pays the bills. For now, this will probably be my final update to those who offered support and kindness. Thank you to the rest. Well, you can figure that out. Thanks for listening, everyone.